Fort Braddock was the kind of place where tradition lingered in the air like gunpowder, unmistakable, stubborn and not easily wiped away. The base had a long history of producing hardened warriors, iron-fisted leaders, and ghosts who never left the field. Even after the wars were over, it was the kind of place where orders weren't questioned and power flowed downward like a steel chain. But then, Captain Alina Torres showed up and something in that chain began to rattle. She wasn't the tallest officer. She didn't have a loud voice or flashing medals. What she did have was presence, the kind that made even seasoned sergeants straighten up when she entered the room, not out of fear, but out of respect. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need the posture. She led through clarity, precision, and something else. Something harder to describe. Maybe it was her eyes. They were sharp, but tired not from sleep, but from experience. She was only 32, but already a seasoned tactical commander, a combat tour in Iraq, 2 more in Afghanistan, commendations for field leadership, a Purple Heart for a wound she never talked about, and more lives saved than she could count. She never bragged, never reminded people what she'd been through. That wasn't her style. Raised in a military family from San Antonio, Alina had learned early that discipline was survival. Her father, a retired Marine drill instructor, never tolerated excuses. Do the job or don't put on the boots. He used to say her mother, a school teacher, taught her something equally vital, how to speak with steel in her voice without raising it an inch. She joined the Army, not because she was chasing legacy, but because she wanted to earn something no one could give her. She trained harder than anyone, stayed later than anyone, and absorbed everything: tactics, theory, survival, chain of command, strategy, and combat ethics. She had no patience for laziness, and even less for injustice. By the time she arrived at Fort Braddock, she had already earned the quiet admiration of those who valued competence over charisma, but admiration didn't shield her from what was coming. Colonel Everett Briggs had been running Fort Braddock like his personal kingdom for 6 years. Decorated from the Gulf War, he was a man who believed in tradition, punishment, and control. On paper, he was respected. In person, he was feared. He called it command presence. Others just called it bullying. He was in his late 50s, with sharp, calculating eyes and a permanent skull carved into his jawline. His boots never had dust on them, even in a desert windstorm. Every soldier knew his wrath. Some had been reassigned because of it. Others simply buried their complaints deep enough to forget. When Elena met him for the first time during officer orientation, he had barely glanced at her. "Another soft promotion," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't flinch. She didn't reply. She just locked eyes with him for a second longer than necessary. That's when the tension began, wordless, slow burning but undeniable. At first, it came in subtle jabs. During officer briefings, he'd cut her off mid-sentence with snide remarks like, "That's a civilian solution, not a soldier's answer." When she submitted detailed training reports, he'd mark them up in red pen with notes like, "Overthinking again. Stick to basics." He questioned her unit's maneuvers, then reissued the same orders under his name the next day. It wasn't criticism. It was erosion designed to wear her down, designed to remind her of where she stood. Alina endured it all with quiet grit. Not because she was weak, but because she knew how the game was played. She wasn't new. She'd seen what happened to good soldiers who spoke up too early or too loud. The Army had rules, but it also had shadows. And in those shadows, people like Briggs thrived. Still, she kept her unit sharp. Under her command, they performed cleaner drills, better field simulations, and tighter logistics. Her soldiers respected her, even if they didn't dare say it out loud around command staff. Then came the whispers, low murmurs in the barracks, stories from female officers who rotated out of Fort Braddock with little explanation, reports of uncomfortable encounters, inappropriate comments, unwelcome proximity. None of it stuck. Briggs had friends in the right places. He had a reputation that reached far beyond the fences of Fort Braddock. But Alina paid attention. One evening, after a grueling 10-hour training session, She returned to her quarters to find a note slid under her door. Be careful. He's watching you closer than the others. No signature, just that. Her skin went cold. 2 weeks later, it happened. She just finished reviewing a logistics map in the ops room. When Briggs entered alone, he shut the door behind him. Captain, he said, his voice low and dismissive. You've got a bad habit of making the men uncomfortable. She didn't respond. You think discipline makes you respected, he continued, stepping closer. It doesn't. It just makes you uptight. Her shoulders straightened. With respect, sir, I'm here to lead soldiers, not make them comfortable. His eyes narrowed. You're bold, Captain, bold for a woman. Her blood froze, but she didn't show it. I take that as a compliment, she said. He moved even closer, close enough that his breath warmed her face. She didn't back down. She didn't raise her voice. She looked him dead in the eye and said, Permission to leave, sir. There was a long pause. His smirk faded. Something in her stare pierced through the rank, the ego, the power. He stepped back slowly. Wordlessly, she walked out without waiting for dismissal. Outside the room, the wind had picked up. It rattled the flag overhead, the same one they all saluted every morning. But something was different. Now something was about to break. And it wasn't her. Asterisk. Alina Torres walked back to her barracks that night, with her fists clenched so tightly that her palms ached. Not from fear, but restraint. She had been in fire bases where mortar fell like rain, but nothing crawled under her skin like that encounter with Colonel Briggs. His words echoed in her ears, bold for a woman, as if rank gave him the right to corner her like prey. As if discipline and decorum were weaknesses, she paced for hours before finally forcing herself into bed, her boots still on dock. By sunrise, the base had returned to its routine, marching orders, sand in every crevice, steel clinking on rifle barrels. But Alina noticed the change. It was in the glances, the ones that lingered too long, the ones that avoided hers altogether. Soldiers who had once saluted her proudly now looked over their shoulders before acknowledging her. Something was shifting, and it wasn't good. Briggs hadn't made a formal move yet, but the message was clear. She had drawn a line. He hadn't forgotten, and he sure as hell wouldn't forgive. During that week's officer briefing, attention became more visible. Alina gave her usual situation report, thorough and crisp. She outlined 3 inconsistencies in a supply drop near the southern range. Nothing controversial, just facts. But halfway through her debrief, Briggs interrupted her with a dismissive wave of his hand. We'll stick to the standard process. I'm not interested in micromanagement from junior officers. The silence in the room was deafening. She wasn't a junior officer. She was a captain, the next in line to lead if Briggs were removed or incapacitated. The comment wasn't ignorance. It was a message. She remained calm, nodded once, and sat down. The other officers shifted in their seats, eyes darting. Some looked embarrassed. None said a word. Later, in the mess hall, she overheard one lieutenant whisper to another. He's gunning for her. Watch your back, Torres. She didn't turn. She didn't react, but inside she filed it away like a mission objective. Target is escalating. Maintain position. Do not retreat. 2 days later, Riggs ordered a surprise physical stress test mile runs, push-ups, sandbag drills in full gear under the noon sun, specifically targeting Alina's unit. She knew the game. He wanted her squad broken down, exhausted, outperformed by others, a public failure he could use against her. But if Briggs had underestimated anything, it was that her team wasn't just trained, they were loyal. Her soldiers admired her because she trained with them, bled with them, and never once demanded respect. She earned it. That afternoon, as they lined up in formation, Alina took her position beside them, helmet on, rifle in hand, not above them. With them got one private. A wiry 19-year-old from Detroit named Morals whispered, "You don't have to run with us, Mom." She gave him a sharp look. "You're not running without me." They finished the circuit first, every last one of them. Briggs watched from the tower above the field, lips tight, clipboard clutched in his hands like he wanted to snap it in half. That night, an anonymous note appeared in Elena's locker. Careful, he's losing face. Bats, when he gets dangerous. No name, no handwriting she could identify, just confirmation of what she already knew. Dot. By the end of the week, Briggs had shifted strategy. Instead of overt displays of power, he started eroding her authority in subtle systemic ways. Supply requisitions from her unit were mysteriously delayed. 2 training simulations were canceled without notice. Her requested promotions for 2 corporals were denied with no justification. And worst of all, Briggs started speaking directly to her squad members, bypassing her completely docked to the outside world. These were bureaucratic hiccups. Internally, they were precision strikes. One evening, as she sat alone in the motor pool reviewing maintenance reports, Staff Sergeant Reeves approached. He was one of her most trusted non-coms, a quiet mountain of a man with 15 years under his belt and eyes that missed nothing. He stood silently for a moment, then said, "We know what he's doing." Elena looked up. "We talk, Captain. We see. We're behind you." Her voice was low. "That's not always enough." Reeves shook his head. "He's not just poking the bear. He's about to punch it." She nodded. "Then let's be ready when he does." It wasn't fear she felt anymore. It was clarity. She had spent her career mastering strategy, tactics, and self-control. She had always believed discipline was the highest strength. But some situations didn't call for silence. Some called for standing so firm that even giants had to step around you or fall trying. That moment came faster than expected. 3 days later, during a public drill exercise in front of 282 soldiers, Colonel Briggs staged a confrontation. Elena had issued a perfectly standard command to reposition half the unit during the live maneuver, but Briggs, standing off to the side, shouted across the field, calling her out. "Captain Torres, who gave you authority to override my formation?" Her voice remained steady per field protocol. "I observed a vulnerability in the left flank and took initiative to." He cut her off, striding forward in front of the entire division. "That's not your call to make." Soldiers turned, eyebrows raised, eyes widened. Something electric crackled in the air. Elena stood her ground. "Sir, I acted in accordance with standard. Don't lecture me on standards." He roared, and that's when he did it. He stepped into her space, closer than protocol allowed. His face inches from hers, his hand raised not fast, not yet striking, but rising. Every breath on that field held still. It was the moment she'd known would come, and she was ready. The air hung heavy still, as if the base itself knew something was about to erupt. A row of clouds passed overhead, darkening the sun just enough to cast long shadows across the dusty drill yard. 2 soldiers stood frozen, in formation, their eyes locked on the 2 figures at the center of the storm. Colonel Everett Briggs, crimson-faced with fury, and Captain Elena Torres, composed but coiled like a spring, standing tall in front of her unit. Briggs' hand was still in the air, not yet descended, but unmistakably raised. That gesture alone defied Army protocol. It was a threat, a warning, and a declaration of power, but more than that, it was a mistake. Elena had trained her entire life to recognize danger, not just on the battlefield, but in moments like this. Power warped into violence. She didn't move yet. She wanted every soldier there to witness the truth of the moment. She hadn't escalated. He had. Briggs leaned closer, his lips curling in a snare. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my men, Captain?" "They're not your men," she thought. Aloud, she replied evenly. "I followed field protocol, sir. You taught it yourself in last month's briefing. That should have been the end of it." But Briggs didn't want logic. He wanted obedience. He wanted fear. And Elena Torres had none to give. "I'll teach you something else right now," he hissed. His hand moved downward. He didn't slap. He struck palm flat, aiming for her face with the kind of force that leaves both physical and psychological marks. But he never made it. The second his shoulder twitched forward, her training kicked. and like a firestorm. Years of Krav Maga, hand-to-hand defense, close quarters combat drills, all compressed into a single explosive second. Her left hand shot up, intercepting his wrist midair. She pivoted, pulled, and stepped through with a practiced fluid motion. Had reversed his force against him. Crack, that the sound echoed across the parade grounds like a gunshot. Every soldier in formation flinched, some out of shock, others from instinct. Briggs dropped to one knee, his mouth agape, breath stolen by pain. His right arm dangled, bent at an unnatural angle, his face turned ashen. Alina released her grip immediately, her body still tight with control. She didn't breathe heavy. She didn't blink. She simply stood over him, her voice even but icy. "You will never raise your hand to me again, Pell." Gasps rippled through the ranks. No one moved. No one spoke. Some looked at each other in disbelief. Others stared at Alina with something close to reverence. A medic sprinted forward from the edge of the yard, already radioing for backup. Briggs didn't speak. Couldn't, maybe. His lips quivered, eyes wide, still processing the shock of pain and humiliation. Alina turned slowly, scanning the formation, making eye contact with her soldiers. Her voice, when she spoke, was firm enough to carry across the field back to attention. Formation remains intact. They obeyed not because of rank, but because something greater had just unfolded before them. Respect was no longer commanded. It had been earned, burned into the dirt beneath their boots. From the second-story observation tower, Major Glossman and a cluster of junior officers watched the scene with wide eyes and slack jaws. No one had expected this. Not even those who had long suspected Briggs' behavior would one day explode. But no one had expected her to be the one who detonated the silence. Within minutes, the drill was officially suspended. Soldiers were dismissed back to their barracks, though few moved quickly. The energy on base had shifted. Rumors spread like wildfire, faster than any radio transmission could keep up with. Did she really break his arm? He tried to hit her. She didn't even flinch. She stood there like a damn statue. About time, someone stood up to him. Back in the officers' quarters, Alina sat alone at her desk, helmet removed. Hands clasped tightly, still vibrating from the adrenaline. Her muscles ached, not from the takedown, but from the control it had taken not to do more. She hadn't wanted to hurt him, but she had refused to be humiliated, especially not in front of her soldiers. Not again. A sharp knock rattled the door. She opened it to find Staff Sergeant Reeves. His face was unreadable, but his eyes gleamed. "Captain," he said quietly, words already moving up the chain. She nodded. "I figured." He looked past her for a moment into the quiet space of her office. Then back at her. "Don't worry. You didn't lose anyone out there today. If anything, you earn more loyalty than some officers get in 20 years. She didn't smile. Not yet. Instead, she said, "This won't be the end of it." "No, ma'am," he replied. "It's the beginning." Within the hour, military investigators arrived at the base. Medical personnel confirmed Briggs' injury, a full radial fracture. The official paperwork began. Testimonies were collected, statements taken, video footage from field cameras retrieved. But even before the inquiry had formally begun, something far more significant had taken root. The soldiers of Fort Braddock had witnessed something they'd never forget. Not a brawl, not a rebellion, but a woman standing unshuckable in the face of abuse, prepared to absorb whatever consequence might follow. And quietly around the base, whispers turned into voices. She stood her ground. She showed us how. She snapped more than his arm. She snapped the silence. Word traveled faster than official reports ever could, long before the investigators submitted their first formal memo. Port Braddock had already changed. The colonel's scream, cut off abruptly by the snap of bone, had rung through every corner of the drill yard, and in its wake came silence, heavy, unblinking, breathless silence. But the kind of silence that doesn't come from fear. The kind that comes from realization. The kind that comes before everything changes. Colonel Briggs was carried away on a stretcher 30 minutes later, his arms secured and immobilized, his ego far less stable. He didn't look at anyone, not his soldiers, not the medics, not even the general who rushed in after the commotion. The once imposing man who strode across the grounds like a warlord now lay vulnerable, his mouth tight, his pride shattered. And Elena Torres, she didn't hide. She didn't run. She stood in place while the field cleared around her, shoulders squared, boots grounded, the same way she'd stood in combat zones. This wasn't about rage. It had never been about revenge. It had been about a line that once crossed, demanded action. As protocol dictated, she was ordered to report immediately to the administrative wing. The investigating officer, a rigid colonel from the Pentagon named Felix Meyer, sat behind a metal desk in a sterile office where time seemed to freeze. He had the footage already playing on loop drone cam, helmet footage, a base surveillance angle, each one replaying the same 2-second takedown from different angles. When Elena stepped into the room, Meyer paused the video. His eyes met hers. "Have a seat, Captain." She did. He leaned forward, tapping a pen on the table. "Colonel Briggs's arm is broken. You fractured the radius. He says you attacked him in front of the entire battalion." Elena didn't blink. He raised his hand to strike me. Meyer nodded. "So I see the footage confirms that, but still you acted physically against a superior officer. That's a serious matter." Her voice was even. "He attempted to strike me. That's also a serious matter." He let that hang for a moment, then he leaned back. "Why didn't you de-escalate?" "I did," she said calmly. "By stopping the assault before it landed with minimum force." He stared at her. She stared back. The truth between them was a wall. Neither could step around. He tapped the video file again, sighing. "There are going to be hearings, formal ones. But you know what's odd, Captain? Since the incident, my inbox is filled with statements from your fellow officers. Some short, some detailed, but they all mention the same thing. Colonel Briggs' history." She said nothing. I thought this might be an isolated incident. That's what the file suggested. But it turns out it's not. Again, she remained silent. "Do you know what else they say?" he asked. She waited. "They say you didn't act out of impulse. You acted with control. They say you're a good officer, a better leader than most, and that if it had been anyone else standing in front of Briggs that day, there would have been blood." She looked him dead in the eyes. There almost was. Colonel Meyer didn't press further. He handed her a temporary suspension order and escorted her out. No handcuffs, no shouting, no shaming. Outside, soldiers stood in scattered groups. Some paused in conversation as she passed. Others watched silently, not out of judgment, but something different. Recognition. Respect. Sergeant Reeves waited at the edge of the walkway, arms folded. As she approached, he fell in step beside her. "They taking you off the line?" he asked. She nodded. "Until they decide if stopping an assault on an officer is still punishable." He exhaled to his nose. "This place has needed a reckoning for a long time." She didn't answer. She didn't need to dawdle at the far edge of the training field. A group of young privates stood whispering. One of them, Mora, watched her with wide eyes, not afraid, not scandalized. Inspired. She looked away. This wasn't about legacy. She hadn't acted for applause. But it was too late now. She had lit a fire and people were warming their hands by it. That night, her barracks door stayed closed. She didn't eat dinner. She didn't scroll through the base intranet or read the Army Code of Conduct. She sat on the edge of her bunk, boots still on, and stared at her hands, not shaking, not sorry, just quiet. In the morning, she would wake up in a new version of Fort Braddock, one where everyone remembered what they'd seen. A curl crossing, the line and a captain refusing to bow. Outside her door, taped up without a signature, was a hand-drawn sketch, just pencil on paper. It showed a soldier standing tall while a shadow loomed behind her, its hand raised. The soldier didn't flinch. She didn't look back, and across the top scrolled in rough block letters, "Strength isn't loud. It just doesn't move." By the next morning, Fort Braddock was a battlefield of whispers. The physical confrontation between Colonel Briggs and Captain Alina Torres had ignited more than just scandal. It had exposed a long, simmering wound in the command structure. The phrase, "she snapped his arm," was on every tongue. But underneath it, a different conversation had begun. One deeper, one overdue. She stood up. She didn't flinch. She did what we all wish we could have done. The Army didn't like drama. The institution thrived on order, discipline, routine. So when something disrupted that rhythm, especially something physical, public, and caught on camera, it scrambled to respond. Investigators had already arrived the previous night, but now higher-ups from the regional command were flown in. Meetings were called, emergency briefings held. The words containing the fallout were heard more than once. But this wasn't a scandal that could be contained, because the story wasn't just about a broken arm. It was about what that arm represented. Unchecked authority, power without accountability, a system that turned away when abuse wore a uniform, and now someone had cracked that system like a dry bone. Alina Torres sat quietly in a makeshift administrative room set up in the medical wing where she was temporarily assigned while the investigation unfolded. She wasn't in handcuffs. She wasn't under arrest. She was officially on administrative reassignment pending inquiry, but unofficially, she was the center of gravity. Officers walked past her with conflicted expressions, some cold, some respectful, some quietly grateful. A few avoided her altogether, not out of contempt, but fear of being seen taking a side. The base was dividing, not violently, but clearly. Those who had suffered silently under Briggs' rule felt something close to justice. Those who had benefited from his reign of fear felt the tremble of shifting ground beneath their boots. She wasn't surprised. Truth had a way of forcing people to choose. Staff Sergeant Reeves visited during midday. He brought her a lukewarm coffee, and a look that said everything. "They're scared," he said. "Of me?" Alina asked. "Of what you started." She looked out the window at the motor pool below. Soldiers moved with routine precision, but their eyes were alert, their posture just a little more upright. There was an energy in the air, tense, expectant. Reeves leaned against the doorframe. "I've been here 10 years. You know how many complaints Briggs had against him." She turned back. "Officially, 0. But off the record, I've got a list in my head a mile long. So do a lot of us, mostly women. Some junior officers, one chaplain. They all walked, transferred out, silenced." Alina was in shock. She'd seen the same pattern in other commands, but here it had metastasized, untouched, unchecked. "I didn't hit him to prove a point," she said quietly. "I know," Reeves replied. "But you did anyway." That afternoon, the whispers turned into statements. Dozens of them got anonymous submissions, signed testimonies, years of suppressed complaints now flowing like a breached dam. Soldiers, both enlisted and commissioned, stepped forward to describe years of verbal abuse, threats, harassment, and career sabotage. What Alina had triggered wasn't an incident thought, it was a reckoning. Briggs, still in the hospital wing, refused comment. His lawyer, a defense legal advisor flown in from D.C., issued a brief statement claiming he'd been provoked and had acted in the interest of maintaining order. But the footage said otherwise. 3 camera angles, 1 raised hand, 1 precise takedown, 1 loud, unmistakable snap-out. It didn't help that a week before the incident, he'd given a speech praising old-school discipline and mocking over sensitive culture. The irony was too sharp to ignore. By the end of the day, Alina was summoned into a confidential conference room with 3 senior officers and a legal advisor. The presiding officer, General Marlene Huxley, was a stone-faced woman who had clawed her way up through decades of combat service in bureaucratic trenches. She studied Alina for a long moment before speaking. "Captain Torres," she began, "you've caused quite a disruption." Alina didn't respond. She didn't know yet if that was meant as praise or accusation. Huxley continued. "The footage is clear. The testimonies are damning for Colonel Briggs. However, your conduct still breaks protocol, striking a superior regardless of context, puts us in a difficult position. I didn't strike him, Alina said. Voice call. I defended myself, which you're entitled to, the legal advisor chimed in. But self-defense in the army isn't defined the same way it is on the street. Your restraint is noted. So is the proportionality of your response. There was a pause. We're not here to punish you, Captain, Huxley finally said. But we also cannot ignore the implications. Alina straightened her posture. I understand, but with respect, ignoring it is what let him operate like this. For so long, that stopped Huxley. For a brief moment, something flickered behind the general's eyes. Memory? Maybe. Understanding? She nodded once. There will be an official inquiry, she said. But between us, what you did has already changed this base. You should be prepared for more attention, possibly more responsibility. Alina didn't flinch. I didn't ask for it, she said. No, Huxley agreed. But sometimes leadership is about what you stand for when no one else will. As Alina left the room, a junior officer passed her in the hallway and saluted not stiffly, not formally, but with a slight nod of respect at the salute of one soldier to another, one who had just lit the path forward. 3 days after the incident, Fort Braddock didn't feel like Fort Braddock anymore. The air was sharper. Orders were delivered more carefully. Even the cadence of drills sounded different. Less like a performance and more like soldiers reclaiming their dignity. For the first time in years, troops spoke openly during chow, not in hushed tones. Even the motor pool buzzed with subtle change. But while the surface simmered with new energy, underneath a war was still being fought, one without bullets. One fought with paperwork, politics, and perception. Captain Alina Torres remained on administrative reassignment. Her uniform was still crisp, but her duty roster was empty. No briefings, no squads, no field time. She spent most of her days in a small office reviewing logistics records or assisting with non-critical tasks. A placeholder, a pause, but not a silence. Because while her boots weren't in the mud, her name was everywhere, on every inbox, every hallway whisper, every legal memo dot. She had become the face of something bigger than she had intended, and that terrified the Army's upper ranks even more than the broken arm of one of its colonels. The next morning, a new face arrived on base, Brigadier General Curtis Lawton, sent directly from the Department of the Army headquarters, a man with polished boots, unreadable eyes, and a history of silencing scandals before they hit. Headlines. He called a closed-door meeting with General Huxley and the legal team. The message was clear. Calm the waters. Reassert control. Keep Fort Braddock off the front page. But there was a problem. The story was already moving. Blogs had picked it up. Military forums were filled with speculation. A phrase, the snap heard round the base, was trending on private veteran networks. Anonymous sources, likely junior officers, had leaked that the Army's internal review had already uncovered a history of misconduct by Colonel Briggs. The number of complaints had passed 30, some going back 8 years, some shelved, some resolved quietly with reassignment. Briggs, meanwhile, had been transferred out of the base hospital under armed escort. He hadn't spoken to the press, but his lawyer had issuing a press release calling the incident a career assassination and claiming the Army had allowed toxic feminism to infiltrate the command structure. The backlash was instant from both sides. Some officers echoed his words behind closed doors. Others ripped their rank patches off in protest and posted photos with the caption, "Protect those who protect others." That evening, Captain Torres was called once again to General Huxley's office. This time, General Ton was waiting. He didn't offer a seat. "Captain," he said coldly, "you've made quite a name for yourself." She didn't flinch. "I didn't ask to." "No," he agreed, "but the consequences of your actions, whether justified or not, are spiraling fast." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There are journalists calling every hour. A senator is asking questions. Veterans are organizing. You become the focal point of a movement. Captain, and movements aren't good for discipline." Elena met his gaze. "Neither is protecting abusers." That hung in the air like a charge, waiting to ignite. Eltina's jaw tightened. You're walking a very thin line. Alina stood straighter. So was he. I just didn't let him cross it. General Huxley finally interjected. Sir, with respect, the situation has already moved beyond internal control. We either lead the conversation or get drowned by it. Lelton exhaled, clearly displeased. Fine, then we control the message. Captain Torres will be transferred temporarily to Westfield Command Center. Publicly, it will be labeled a rotation. Privately, it gets her out of the line of fire while this cools down. Alina raised an eyebrow. You're removing me from the base. Latron smirked. We're promoting you, Captain. That stunned her. He turned to Huxley. Submit the paperwork. Effective immediately. Make it clean. No press statements until we draft one. Then he left, boots echoing down the corridor. Outside the building, Staff Sergeant Reeves was waiting. You're being moved? He asked. Has she stepped out? She nodded. West Command Center rotation effective now? He hesitated. Is that a win? Alina didn't answer immediately. They're dressing it up like one, she said eventually. But it's containment. But they didn't bury you, Reeves replied. That counts. She looked out over the base. Soldiers continued. Their routines, but there was a shift. Tiny, but real. More heads held high. More backs straightened. More voices raised without fear. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was just the beginning. That night, she packed her gear in silence. The barracks were still. Her duffel was almost full when a quiet knock tapped on her door. Private Morrill stood there, nervous but determined. Ma'am, she said, saluting. I just wanted to say thank you. Not for what you did to him, but for what you showed us. Alina nodded. Hold the line private. Morrill's eyes welled slightly. We will. As the door closed, Alina sat on the edge of her bed one last time. Her boots were laced, her heart steady. In the end, she hadn't sought glory. She had just refused to look away. And in doing so, she gave others permission to do the same. Westfield Command Center sat on a low rise in Virginia's foggy countryside. A sleek concrete complex built to monitor operations across the Eastern Division. From above, it looked sterile and quiet. Inside, it was anything but. Captain Alina Torres arrived under an official transfer order. Her new title was Strategic Operations Liaison. It sounded impressive, vague, contained, just the way higher-ups wanted it. But something unexpected happened within her first 48 hours at Westfield. They listened to her. Not just her rank, but her voice. The officers she worked with weren't all aware of what had happened at Fort Braddock, but many had heard whispers. A few approached her in the hallway with quiet nods. One commander even thanked her in passing. My daughter's at Fort Riley, he said. I'm glad people like you are still in uniform. Her reassignment hadn't buried her. It had amplified her, and soon she realized it wasn't just Westfield where things were changing. Across bosses Fort Hood, Fort Drum, Camp Pendleton, messages were being forwarded, forms buzzing, letters written, female soldiers and male allies sharing testimonies that echoed the same pattern: intimidation, abuse, silence. But now there was a name attached to resistance. Torres. She had become more than a captain. She had become a symbol. Got 1 week into her new assignment, she was called into a meeting by Major Leela Daniels, an operations analyst known for her bloodiness and battlefield promotions. I've been authorized to put together a task force, Daniels said, sliding a file across the two-table. Unofficial for now. Internal review of command climate, starting with bases that reported unusual complaint suppression. Alina opened the file. Fort Braddock was the first on the list, followed by 5 more. You're not just here to sit behind a screen, Daniels continued. You're here because someone up there finally got the message loud and clear. Alina studied the list. She recognized 2 names, bases she'd served on early in her career. One of them was where she had first learned to keep her mouth shut. Not this time. I'll do it, she said. Daniels gave a half smile. I figured. Meanwhile, Colonel Briggs's story unraveled like cheap thread. A second wave of complaints had emerged, this time from former service members, women who had resigned, men who had been demoted, even a former sergeant major, who admitted he'd been forced into retirement after defending a younger soldier against Briggs's wrath. The military legal division launched a formal investigation. And when media outlets obtained heavily redacted files, the public tide turned. News anchors debated military command culture. Veterans spoke out. A retired general went on record saying, "We tell our soldiers to protect the weak, but we often fail to protect our own." Suddenly, the Army was under scrutiny from Capitol Hill. A bipartisan group of senators demanded an accountability review. And in a move that hadn't happened in over 2 decades, an active duty Colonel Briggs was referred to a public Article 32 hearing. Military justice would be served not behind closed doors, but in full view of the nation. Back at Westfield, Alina was working 16-hour days. She was no longer isolated. She was essential. Her task force reviewed complaint trends, command responses, and discipline records across the region. Patterns emerged shockingly clear. Her team began drafting new policy recommendations, early intervention protocols, third-party reporting structures, and anonymous escalation road bypassing local chain of command. For the first time, real change was on paper. On record, still the weight of her decision at Fort Braddock never left her. Sometimes she lay awake at night, boots at the foot of her bed, wondering what if she hadn't reacted. What if she'd stayed silent as she had before? What if she'd taken the slap, the humiliation, the threat just one more time? But then she'd remember Private Morrell's voice. "We will," and she'd remember her own mother's words the night before Elena left for basic training. "Don't let anyone take your name, not even behind a uniform." 10 days later, she received a letter, official Army stationery, sealed in red. "You are hereby requested to testify before the Article 32 hearing in Washington, D.C. regarding events occurring on Fort Braddock under the command of Colonel Martin Griggs. Her hands didn't shake, not even once. She folded the letter neatly, tucked it into her chest pocket. When she looked up, Major Daniels was already waiting in the doorway. "You ready for what comes next?" Alina gave a quiet nod. "I was ready." The moment I stood up to him, Danielle smirked. "Let's make it official then." News of her testimony broke before she even boarded the transport. Social media exploded again. One headline read, "Soldier who broke the silence, now set to testify Captain Torres to face down the system she defied." And suddenly the question wasn't whether justice would be served, that it was whether the military could face its own reflection and finally make peace with it. The courtroom at Fort Myer was unlike anything Captain Elena Torres had seen in her career. No camouflage here, only formal dress uniforms, oak paneled walls, and the piercing eyes of generals, attorneys, reporters, and witnesses, all converging under a single banner: military justice. It was a rare public Article 32 hearing, open due to overwhelming national interest. A silver-haired judge advocate general presided. Armed guards stood at every exit. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but sketch artists captured every glance, every breath. Colonel Briggs sat at the defense table, wrists still bandaged, ace cold and defiant. He wore his dress blues like armor, chest stacked with ribbons. But the courtroom air didn't bend around him like it once had. That power was gone. He was not in command anymore. Alina entered the courtroom straight back, eyes forward. The hush that fell over the crowd was instant. Even reporters stopped typing. Soldiers in the audience, active duty, retired. Some in civilian clothes sat taller as she passed. She was no longer just a captain. She was a symbol, and symbols did not flinch. The prosecutor called her to the stand. Her oath was clear, strong. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God." She told the panel about that day, not just the slap that never landed, but the years that led to it, the climate, the quiet threats, the women who left, the men who turned their heads, the silence that had become strategy. Colonel Briggs didn't just abuse his power, she said, voice unwavering. He modeled it, taught it, enforced it. and anyone who challenged it became the next target. She paused, then added, I snapped his arm because I feared what might come next, not just for me, but for the 282 soldiers watching. I did what I was trained to do, neutralize a threat. Turns out the threat wasn't foreign. Gasps rippled in the crowd. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. The defense attorney objected, but the judge overruled. Let her speak, Alina continued. Every word landed like a rifle crack. She told them about the report she filed years ago that vanished out the complaint she was told would ruin her career. The junior female soldier who disappeared from her platoon after one private meeting. With Briggs, each detail sharpened the narrative. This wasn't a one-time outburst. It was a system left unchecked until someone pushed back. Colonel Briggs finally spoke in his defense. He called her unstable, a disruption to the chain of command. He said she exaggerated the moment, and that no officer of proper bearing would ever lay a hand on a superior. But his words felt outdated, desperate. The courtroom didn't lean in when he spoke. They leaned away, because this time the story wasn't his to control. Over the next week, 4 more officers testified against him. One lieutenant described being berated in front of an entire formation for refusing to join Briggs during an off-base celebration. Another recounted a drunken outburst where Briggs threatened to ruin a female NCO's life with one call. By the 5th day, the outcome was clear. The panel deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Colonel Martin Briggs was found guilty of conduct unbecoming of an officer and abuse of authority under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was stripped of command, demoted to captain, dishonorably discharged, and referred to federal civilian court for assault and harassment charges. Alina didn't cheer. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and let herself breathe for the first time in months. A week later, she returned to Fort Braddock, not as a soldier under suspicion, but as an invited guest. General Huxley met her at the gates. You were right, he said simply. Alina raised an eyebrow. About what? He paused. About what happens when one soldier stands up. Turns out others follow. He walked her to the parade field where nearly 300 troops waited in formation. Not for punishment, not for inspection, but for recognition. General Huxley handed her a citation. It bore the Army's emblem signed by the Secretary of the Army himself for extraordinary moral courage, physical discipline, and unwavering service to the principles of justice, equality, and honor. He pinned a silver oak leaf cluster to her chest. She had been promoted to major. Cheers erupted from the formation. Some soldiers clapped, some shouted. Morals standing in the 3rd row wiped her cheek. Staff Sergeant Reeves saluted her sharply. A proud grin on his face, she saluted back, and this time she felt it not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as a leader. That night in her new quarters, she opened her notebook, the same one she had used to track every complaint, every silence, every crack in the system. She turned to a fresh page, and at the top she wrote just 2 words, never again. Because the fight wasn't over, It was just the beginning, and she was ready. The end.